This is a really important video for intermediate and studio students. Because you're doing 4 realistic paintings for the semester, all of the things I'm going to do right now apply, except for the fact that you're going to be using local color in one, you're going to be using monochromatic in another, black and white in another, and also all kinds of neutrals and local color as they apply to landscape in the final project. The first 3 projects are still life, and I have a variety in there to choose from. Some you may have seen before, but I have handpicked them over the year because they have all the qualities I'm looking for in terms of shapes, placement, repetition, opportunities for technique, value range, and so on. And then down the line, opportunities for mixing and matching. Later you're going to be using a local color image, and you're going to have to duplicate that color exactly in terms of value, temperature, intensity, and saturation. So that one's going to be the most difficult one because you're going to be doing a lot of mixing and matching. But the main thing that you're going to be dealing with in these projects are technique. Watercolor is technique. I've given you the option of either gesture drawing, which is a loose and messy drawing that takes a lot of time and eye measuring, and then ultimately you're going to clean it up, pick the lines that you want, and transfer just those lines onto the paper. So you also have the opportunity to use a grid or a combination or a larger grid to challenge your drawing skills as you break away from the grid. But even if you don't use a grid, it's always important that the scale of your paper matches the scale of the picture. So if you're using a 15 by 20 paper, print it 8 by 10 and crop off ½ inch on either side. If you had ideally a 16 by 20, you could just use the whole thing, but it doesn't matter. No matter what size of the paper, you want to match the scale. I'm doing a smaller version. I blew up the picture so that you can see how to go about tackling a still life. This applies to all of them. You're going to do a warm-up scale for each. For black and white, you're going to do an even step and a blended. For your temperature, depending on your temperature of your monochromatic, red, blue, or yellow, you're going to be doing your hue to black, your hue to blank, and then 2 blended to those same ones. Depending on what image you choose on that one, you'll be starting with either a middle value and a warm temperature, or a darker value and a cooler temperature. So that one, the color itself will act as a value. You barely have to use black in that second one unless you want to mix it with your hue. But for this one, we're just doing black and white. We're starting with the straightforward values, measuring, rendering, and using the techniques. So the goal here is to use all of the techniques that I did in that warm-up, which are drip down and drip within and flare out and wet and back runs deliberately, back runs accidentally, controlled values, using different flat brushes mostly. This picture is almost all flat brushes. If you rely on your round brushes too much, you're going to end up with a cartoony line drawing that has usually too much saturation. So I always recommend to do almost all of your paintings with a flat brush. You can always come in later and do a little nuance here and there, but if you do, be sure it doesn't become linear, because this is just shapes. All of this. People think it's a line, it's a shape. There's some cases where, like in an acrylic painting class, instead of doing a line, you'd make a shape and then paint white over it. In this case, we have to either do a tiny flat brush sideways or come in later with a very delicate line. You're also deciding right now what are you going to leave white, and you don't have to leave white what's white. This picture just happened to have white in it. It was a print left over from my painting class that I used to put some perspective drawing on the back, but I just wanted to grab something that had a range of value. So the first thing you want to do is determine what's the biggest area to paint. This is after I've done the line drawing. You probably can't see it, and that's the point. You don't want to see the line drawing. So this is done after I did this and then transferred it real lightly in line, and only keeping the lines that you want. And you don't press hard, because if you do, you indent the paper and it's too visible. So only you should be able to see this. It's just a guide. In fact, you don't even need it ultimately, but it helps as you get stronger drawing skills. So you want to have a bunch of flat brushes. Remember, you can use short or long. Long are a little hard to handle, but leftover acrylic brushes sometimes work really well as long as they're soft. Short-handled are more ideal. Now, if I want to fill, let's say, the negative space from here all the way around to start with, I don't want to use too small of a brush. So I want to grab a bigger brush, at least this big, so that I can fill it without streaks. Now I also want to think about, do I want to do a back run? Do I want to just do an even wash? What techniques am I going to use from that list? I think it's helpful to have the list handy, because you have all kinds of choices there, so you can look at those pictures. Okay, I'm going to do an even wash, and all I need is black paint. I'll put it closer. All I need is black paint. Olive, come on. All I need is black paint, and that's it. So I'm going to pull this a little bit closer, and on here I can start mixing different values of black until I have enough water added to where it matches what I want to do. You can even write down all the techniques next to you. Okay, I'm just going to sit here and paint a little bit and talk about what I'm doing. Of course, I can't do a whole painting, but I'm going to let you decide where in your picture you're going to leave white. Based on this picture, I want to leave this white, I want to leave some of this white, I want to leave that handle white. I can always do a gray to it later, but I want to paint around. So there's kind of a blurry edge here. To get that blurry edge, I'm going to paint some water here, just so I don't get a hard edge here. I'm kind of crisscrossing it in, even though I'm doing an even wash below it. I'm going to do a little bit of lighter value in there that blends into here. Not totally white, but I'm applying some water, and it's also defining my boundary. If you do a grid, you might have a cleaner line from the get-go without this whole gestural process, or you can do a combination. And I will attach that other video that I did for your extra credit project so that you can see the same process. Basically, when you open your extra credit assignment, which is optional, you can take a look at how I did a gesture drawing as opposed to just a clean line like this from a grid or from just for a demo. I just want you to see like the technique. So I'm getting some in here, some light gray for the background, and now I need to weave in my darker gray, but I want to do an even wash, so I'm not going to dampen the whole thing. You can see I'm kind of wiping off the brush as I go so that it acts as a sponge, and I'm getting familiar with the brush. I might switch if I don't like it. I'm going to take a drier brush and kind of dry this as I go. The most important thing of all of these projects is technique. So think in your head the name of the technique, how you're going to talk about it. Obviously right now I'm going to talk about even wash and then wet and wet blending above it. So I'm going to come in now with slightly darker value. Always err on the side of lighter. And I want to capture this shift in here. If you can see it, it's very subtle. Below it is going to be even wash. And I'm drawing and painting at the same time, because I couldn't see all the lines that were transferred from the yellow, which is actually really good. And remember, I got to be cognizant of things drying too fast because I don't want to get that edge in there. And I don't want to keep it to such an extent that it's these heavy lines. So I have a certain amount of time. I'm nuancing this area. And it's a great way to start because you're taking away your negative space and letting things become foreground. And you have to keep your eye on the time because if it starts to dry, you're going to have to pull that into the wet again. But this is a very delicate technique in the back. I might want to use a more dramatic one elsewhere. It's blurry over here too with this napkin. So I might want to do a little wet and wet over there too. And because it's so light, I'm still drawing. I'm going to put more water on the top. Get a little bit more of a dry brush, pull that back down. Little crisscross. This one's a little more absorbent. And you may decide to do a back run up here. I just made a decision to play with this blending in. I actually really like this, so part of me wants to just leave it. Making a nice cauliflower. You know, you make decisions as you go. You can't always keep the plan. If something works, like that worked really nicely. I'm still doing my technique, but I'm featuring this area a little bit more and I'm kind of really digging it. So basically I have a little more blending. Like I did on the top, a little more wet. Oh, that's pretty. I'm really liking that. I want to make sure my value doesn't get too dark. And the way to do that is let it dry because it always gets lighter when it dries in watercolor. I want to make sure I get around this. So I'm weaving it in. The main thing is I'm navigating the puddles so that I don't end up with streaks. You know, streaks are worse than a little back run, but I think I'm getting it pretty good. See, I'm using the brush as a sponge because I don't want to use a paper towel as a sponge. This got a little dark, but this is one of those moments where if you keep working it, you're going to end up with problems. I didn't want to deal with the flooring yet because that's a lot to take on while I'm going here. So I'm going to end this side to side right here because that's where the texture of the floor starts. And it's so subtle that I'll just leave it as is when I get to it later. Now I got to address this over here. This got a funky right here. So I got to take a look at the drawing part. And let's see where this goes. This goes here. This is the inside of there. Okay, there's a little. There we go. It's starting to dry a little. But I don't want to overwork this too much because then I get streaky. But I think I'm still safe because the paper is still a little bit damp. Okay, definitely got to stop there. It's not perfect, but then again, I have the tracing or the carbon or the paper to trace with. Either way, you can trace that and then transfer, but the point is I can do this a lot of times. I'm just starting to see and figure out what I want to do here. This ends here. I've got this napkin, very soft napkin here, barely visible, so I want to keep it soft. I didn't even bother drawing that part because it's so soft. So now this is moving a little bit too much because it's still damp up there. Do a little bit to nuance that back in. Love over here. See, that worked out great. So if I did this again, which is important to do, get it dry once you pull that white back out. It's all about speed. I don't want to go too dark back there because then it won't match the value. Alright, so overall I'm pretty pleased. I'm a little disturbed by this area, but I went light enough that I can always build upon that when it's dry. Okay, what other area of value can I get? Now I want to get a smaller flat brush. I'm going to get a slightly bigger flat brush because I want to do this value. I've decided I want to do this value. Now I can compare this value to the background and to this. Even though they're both going to dry lighter, I can compare one to the other. Now, this is why you have paper on the sides. Always have a scratch paper on the side. And then I want to see if this matches. That looks pretty darn good, and I'm going to go even wash. I see a drawing error. I'm going to correct it with paint. It swoops a little bit more than I have it on here. No problem. And then I also have to do over to here. Now it gets a little bit lighter, but still appears like even wash over to here. They're like little squares. Hard to see, but there are definitely little squares. And then a little reflected light at the bottom, but not white. A little darker in there. And now I'm thinking for this area, rather than doing the same boring thing I did before, but still making it look like the same person did it, I'm going to do a little glazing. Glazing meaning I'll do some patches and then come back tomorrow and build another layer, or at least much later in the day when it's fully dry. These are fun areas here to do that. Do different layers. And over here, as long as I'm matching the value, I'm going to build the values on top later. We've got a nice opportunity here to flare out without it being a line. It's more of a line there, but as I was saying before, like instead of a line, if you can take a flat brush and go side to side, it'll be much easier to make it look like it has some depth to it instead of a flat surface, because this area is behind this even though it's a highlight. So I'm gonna just do a sideways line. See, basically you're just getting to know the subject. That's why we have a simple line drawing to start, because you're actually painting without a pencil. And now I'm seeing how I want to build this. So it's a process. It's going to take a long time to develop your pictures. That's why you have nearly a month for each one, which means you should do it several times. Too dark. I should have tested it over here. See, that's the problem. If you test it, it avoids that. So now I'm going to test it because obviously I went too dark. See how dark that is? Try to get in that habit. It's easy to forget and then you have a problem. But luckily I caught that soon enough. The other thing to watch out for is try not to use the same brush for everything. And try to view it as a whole as you go. I'm starting slowly to get more comfortable and remembering and being confident about my skills and about the techniques. But this is just one layer. I mean, this is going to, you have to let it dry, come back, and what I like to do is do another version of this while you're waiting for this to dry. And that way you can try different techniques on each one. You can even turn these in as a pair or as a triple. This gets pretty light right there. That's an opportunity for lift out. Except I don't have a paper towel with me, so I'm not going to do lift out there. I don't really feel like running and getting one, but that would have been a good spot for it, but it doesn't matter because I can do some other techniques. I'm going to do something fun here. I'm going to do a little back runs. Let's see. Taking advantage of the fact that I didn't do the lift out. Test, 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 always. Sometimes I forget to test because I'm so familiar with the material, but at the student level you really need to test, actually all the time, but especially when you're not familiar with how the value looks on the palette and how the brush works. If you're not familiar with the brush, it's really helpful to just go like this and go, okay, that's really dark, but I'm doing it within here. I told you I want to get some backgrounds to make a little bit of a beautiful watercolor technique. And it butts up to here. So I can do a little glazing next to my back runs because it's a really funky looking shadow. Comes to here, and I'm trying to draw it not as a line but as a shape. Okay, I just saw something I want to do here. Boom, boom. So now I'm getting into the drawing part. You want to start to kind of forget about your line drawing a little bit. It's nice to have a dry brush at your disposal, fully dry, to almost act like a lift out, but much more subtle and beautiful than a lift out with a paper towel, which is more textural. Okay, this is getting fun in here. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit darker in here. It's all speed. Define an edge, but you don't want to define all the edges all at once. See, see now, look at that. That's cool. When you start just filling everything in all at once, that's when it gets really overworked and tacky. You know, you want to really deliberately make your marks so that you're not doing this. Like I would never do this whole thing. I'm just picking areas that will work for that technique. And it takes a while to get used to this subject. Better. Now here, this is a little lighter, so I can put that. I'm kind of painting it all together. You don't need to paint it all separate. And remember, this is one layer, it'll dry a different way. Up and down, up and down, up and down, not side to side, never side to side. People always do that, boom, 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 boom. And it's like, no, it's a flat surface and it's geometric and it goes up and down. It also forces you to slow down when you do that and not just do a big old edge repeatedly all the way. You can see I'm being very selective with where I'm putting this. And I'm being really careful not to lose my whites. Once I lose my whites, I have problems. Way too dark, obviously, but I see a dark right in here. I can block this in now. See how it's not dark here, but it's darker in here? So I can do a little wet and wet right here, like I have here, for pop. But I'm being super selective, because I can always make it darker later. And if I go in too soon while it's wet, I lose my opportunity for a hard edge. So I'm just going to go a little further from there. It's a little bit. Even though this is not white in here, I might decide to leave it white just because it looks better aesthetically. It's probably the darkest thing in there. There's a little bit here I can put next to this gray. I can do a little wet and wet in here. And this is what you're going to do with every single painting the entire semester. There's nothing different about any of these. There's no reason for me to show you any differently, because they're all still life, except for the last one's a landscape, and they're all, except for the last one, you know, scales to begin with, so you know your palette. This is what it's about, is this technique. And this testing on the side, and this leaving white strategically, and trying to keep your mind on everything that's going on all at once, so that you don't let things dry that you don't want to. Like here, there's here, and then there's a value here, but I'm leaving white where those strippy things are, and I'm leaving white in here, because you can see it in there. It's like a ledge. Don't worry about the subject. You're only painting shapes and values. This is a little funky. I'm not happy with that. Before it dries, I'm going to lighten it just a little. The only corrections you can make are to redraw on top after it dries, and the only way you can do that is to let it dry. Like, I can tell I made a mistake here. Let me get a towel. The one recourse you have in watercolor is put water on top, wait a minute or so, and then you can blot. All that's going to do is lighten it, but if you start blotting and not just press once, it gets really, it doesn't look good. I'm looking now at this value in here while I'm waiting for that correction, and I'm going to do, and sometimes things happen wrong and it's okay. It ends up looking all right. See how I'm making sure this value isn't as dark as the background, because it's like a yellowish in here, but it still reads as a gray. I'm going really deliberately. You know, it's like, okay, there's a light at the top here. So now I can say, okay, I just did a lift out there. So when you're in critique, you can say, okay, I did wet and wet here. I started out with even wash here, did wet and wet. This happened. This was off, so I put some water to let it a little bit sit a minute. You can talk about what values look good and what don't. This can be blotted too. And then I'm going to just lighten this a little. Better. Subtle, but makes a difference. And I still have to do something with the bottom. I might just leave it only because, let me get a bigger brush. I might leave it only because it's nice to have the white down here, but I'll decide later. Test, test, test. Okay. The reason I got a bigger brush for this area is so I don't get streaks and I can do it quickly. And I can take a look at that rendering issue that happened. The biggest issue was I didn't break it up into pieces enough. You can see how you build slowly. And it's always good to be working on another one at the same time. And because this is dark, I'm going to have to create a dark later, but try to refrain from, a dark elsewhere. Try to refrain from putting water and blotting. That's only for if you really drew it in the wrong place and you need to make that correction. That looks pretty good. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Now this is going to define this lid laying on its side. So now I'm breaking up that dark that I made that I thought was a little too heavy. It's a very strange shadow here, but it is one of the darkest places in the picture. And this is too dark right here, so put a little water, blend it in. But I think the best thing you can do is do several at once. As I can see over here now, this value is darker. See, doing one makes you see the other. And I'm able to build on this because I didn't make it too dark the first time around. If I rush too dark, then I'm very limited. See, now that's looking better. And then in here now I see this. And I'm doing up and down, but very systematically. I'm not just filling. And I'm doing glazing now. Remember I talked about that over here. But it's still a little damp. It would be better if I had set this aside. And then you see how this value gets lighter as it goes? Most people just go clunk. But what you need to do is mix another value that's lighter and then continue it up and down. So it fades into this lighter area, which then there's a nice light right here. You can do a lift out right there of that highlight. I'm going to keep it almost white and then do that circular shape. So you're either really getting helped by this, or you're like, I'm over it, I want to paint. So I'll stop and keep, this is too solid. Oh, see, that helped a lot right there. Lifting out right here, it made this less solid. And now I can put back a little bit of this dark, it kind of flares out. I know this is a very weird shadow because of a student that did this one before. It's just a very peculiar, it looks like a hole. So I just happen to have this picture laying around. I made sure none of your pictures look weird just looking at it. See this one? I gotta go darker right here. And I like to put the picture above, not to the side. I find it very distracting to look side to side. It's like when you're on an easel, you want to paint up and not. See, now you can see here, I'm going to leave this white, but see how here this blends into that? So this would be an area maybe I want to do wet and wet blending or a glaze. I'm doing a glaze crisscross. As long as those values match up, see how it dried lighter there? Then you're in good shape. Now this is too big, so I might need a smaller brush and a darker value. You can see how though I'm starting to do the right thing over here with this testing. I'm not going to fix this by erasing it, I'm just making it narrower on top. And because I did the value lighter, I'm able to do that. And if it were dry, I could get it really, really the right shape. Better to leave something blank. I'm doing a lot of glazing, you can tell here, a lot of patchy, which I'm digging because I did so smooth on the top. It's a nice contrast. And if it overworks, start over or do several at once. Just be sure you have a little swatch thing, range of value. In your head, think about what techniques am I using? Am I matching the values okay? Am I being very deliberate so I don't overwork or get streaks or blots or torn paper? All that kind of stuff. There's a lot in your head going on at the same time. And definitely try to use a flat brush and build up so that at the end you could do a little flare of a round brush. If you can remember to go up and down, that's really helpful too. So you start going up and down. It's totally a process. I mean, I can't just say it's going to look great all of a sudden, but I already feel like, oh, I have to redo this, which is fine. But I just wanted you to see the process you're going to do on every single painting. It's starting to go. You can see the problem areas and you can see what needs to be done. But I do see some technique, wet and wet, glazing, value range, working with a flat brush, testing. That's what we're looking for.